In this lecture, I want to go over Vuex. So Vuex is a state management tool for Vue applications. It serves as a global centralized store where we can keep some data that we need globally and that will be shared and accessed by lots of other components. So let's go inside our store here, inside this index, and let's explore what we have inside. So we can see that the first thing that we are doing is we are importing this create store function. And when we call it here, we actually create a new store instance. And we also have a couple of properties inside, so let's explore them one by one. So Vuex uses a single state tree, which means that a single object contains all our application level state, and it serves as the single source of truth. So as usually, you will only have a one store per application. So inside here, let's define a user. Only for testing purposes, we will not actually have users inside this application. So the only way to change the state is by committing a mutation. The mutation has a type and also has a handler function. But first, I want to define a set user constant, and I will explain why we can use constants. So set user here. Well, with constants, it is much clearer of all the mutations that we are performing inside this file. So then here, if we define a set user type of mutation, and here, well, then we have this handler function that I mentioned, where we have state as our first parameter, and then we have payload as our second parameter, which is data that will be updated or set inside our state. So here we are setting user, so I will rename this to user. And then inside this mutation, we can update this user state. So state.user equals to user. Moving on to actions. Well, we dispatch actions from, let's say, our components, and then actions commit mutations. Actions can contain both synchronous and asynchronous code inside. So for example, we can perform API calls inside actions, and when we receive the result, we commit a mutation and update the state with new data. So inside, let's create a new set user action that receives a context object as a parameter, and context object just exposes some set of methods and properties on our store instance. And we can destructure a commit property here, and inside, well, call API, or we can receive a payload from some component. So for example, we can have a user data here, and then we can commit a set user mutation and then just pass this user here. And just one thing to mention, mutations, they always have to be synchronous. So you have to send prepared data inside mutation to update the state. Another thing that we can register here inside our store are getters, and I will skip modules for now and talk more about modules in the next lecture. So here we have getters, and getters are essentially functions, but they cache the underlying result, and the result will only reevaluate if the dependency upon which this getter function is counting on has changed. So for example, let's have a function here is user admin that takes in the state, and then here we can return a boolean. So if state.user.role, for example, equals to admin, which we then can use in any of our components to prevent user from seeing something if he is not admin. We can also define functions that filter some data before we return them to our components. So we don't have to repeat these functions inside all of our components. We can just group them here and have a single place for these functions.